Could Nolan Arenado fall into the Mets' laps this offseason? I'll talk about that and the Mets signing of Griffin Canning on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. The college football playoff is here, and you don't want to miss a moment of the action. The college football playoff presented by Allstate begins with 4 first-round games December 20th and the 21st on ESPN, ABC, TNT, and Max. Now, the biggest news of the day for the New York Mets is the fact that they signed another starting pitcher, Griffin Canning. I'm going to talk about that in the final segment today, but I wanted to open the show with what I think is a more interesting discussion, and that is Nolan Arenado. Because we have known for some time that Nolan Arenado was going to get traded. I did a podcast on this on October 30th, where there was a report out there that the Cardinals were looking to shed payroll, and some of their veterans like Sonny Gray, Nolan Arenado, and Wilson Contreras could be on the trade block. Now, in that show, my conclusion through it all was that Nolan Arenado is clearly on a decline, but the contract is not as bad as you would think it is, considering it was originally an 8-year, $260 million deal, but the Rockies are eating some money. It was front-loaded, so the back years aren't that bad, and ultimately, I ended up deciding that the one way I'd be okay with the New York Mets trading for Nolan Arenado is if they got closer Ryan Helsley in the deal, and if they had signed Juan Soto to replace Pete Alonso's production. So you have Pete Alonso gone, but Soto replaces a lot of it. You have Arenado at third, you have Vientos at first, and Ryan Helsley is now a setup man to Edwin Diaz. That was my conclusion back then. Now, one of the things that we understand with the Cardinals is it does not appear like Ryan Helsley is on the table. It's sort of been reported that they're planning to take him into the season and then potentially trade him at the deadline where they might be able to get a better package. Devin Williams just got traded, so that clears one of the top relievers off the board before we even get towards the start of the season, much less the trade deadline, and I'm sure the Cardinals are looking at that as a more opportune time to deal him. But they apparently had a deal in place to trade Nolan Arenado, and the reporting around this now non-trade makes Arenado a little bit more attractive and also makes you wonder where his home is going to be. So, apparently the Houston Astros, who have Alex Bregman in free agency right now, they were looking at Arenado as his replacement. They just made a trade, sending Kyle Tucker away to the Cubs and getting Isaac Paredes back. Paredes could be their third baseman, but apparently they were thinking they'd slide Paredes to first and trade for Arenado. This is from The Athletic's Katie Wu and Chandler Rome. In their story, they say, by the end of the weekend, the Astros had a deal in place to acquire the third baseman, and there was a growing sense within the organization that would land the 8-time All-Star. Instead, according to multiple league sources, Arenado declined to waive his no-trade clause, preferring not to make a decision this early in the offseason. That decision, first reported by MLB.com on Wednesday, is not final, and the Cardinals and Astros will continue conversations. It's unclear whether the Astros will continue heavily pursuing Arenado or pivot to other options. Uncertainty surrounding Bregman, coupled with the club's trade of Tucker, gave Arenado at least some pause about the Astros' long-term outlook, according to one source. Now, let's just start here. Nolan Arenado gave the Cardinals at the end of the season a list of teams. According to the reporting here in the story, the Astros were originally on that full no-trade clause list, the teams that he would be willing to waive that full no-trade clause for, but after what just happened with the Tucker trade, he decided to hold on potentially waiving the no-trade clause to play there. He wants to see how the offseason plays out, and I really think what you're looking at here with Nolan Arenado, he's in the driver's seat completely, right? And he has an opportunity here to see what happens with Alex Bregman. Is Alex Bregman going to sign with the Red Sox? Is he going to sign with the Yankees? See, what exactly the following moves are going to be for the Astros or for another team that might be in on his services. And then near the end of the offseason, when he gets a complete picture of these teams who are maybe inquiring about him, he can then pick a destination. Oh, I want to play there. Now, what makes that a little bit more attractive is the fact that Arenado is picking the destination, and trades like this generally don't result in much of any prospect capital heading the other way. We just saw a trade similar to this. Cody Bellinger. Now, his contract was essentially a 1+1 now. He's under contract for 2025. Has a player option for 2026. The Cubs didn't want him on their payroll anymore. The Yankees send Cody Petite over in the deal, who's essentially just a depth arm that can be optioned down to the minor leagues. It's really not much of anything. It just gives the Cubs something. And some money came back in that deal as well. You look at the Giancarlo Stanton trade of years ago. Now, Stanton was coming off an MVP, which is a lot different than Bellinger or even Arenado. He was at the absolute peak of his powers, but he had a ton of money left on that contract. The Marlins had a deal in place with the Giants, and was it the Reds? Who else was it? There was two teams. I know the Giants for sure. I was reading it today. I can't remember who the second team was. The Reds don't make any sense. It couldn't have been the Reds. Gosh, I cannot remember the second team. Doesn't really matter to the point of this, though. They had a trade in place to send Giancarlo Stanton to another team, right? But Stanton didn't want to go there. So ultimately, he got to pick, and I remember he said Dodgers or Yankees, and that's how he ended up on the Yankees. The best piece the Marlins got back in that trade was Starlin Castro, who just filled an infield spot for them for a couple of years, but really they got nothing. They were just getting the contract off the books. So the first thing you have to think about when it comes to Nolan Arenado is if the New York Mets traded for him, it wouldn't cost really anything. And you look at the other teams that were on that no-trade list. You have the Dodgers, who have pretty much already indicated they will not be in an Arenado. They have Max Muncy to play third base. Theoretically, they could slide him to second base if they really wanted to, but they also have Gavin Lux there. They have Miguel Rojas that can rover between shortstop and second. It seems like Mookie Betts is going to be their shortstop next season, and Tommy Edmonds is going to be their center fielder. But the bottom line is they don't really have a need to take on any risk on Arenado, a 3-year deal for a guy in his mid-30s. They can just sort of pass on this opportunity because they have enough options in place. You had the Angels on that list of teams he might waive the no-trade clause for, and I believe that is solely the fact that Nolan Arenado is a SoCal guy. It'd be going home. I don't think he actually expects to win with the Angels, but maybe he'd be willing to go there. They have Anthony Rendon, though. Not that that should prevent them from acquiring a third baseman, but I don't know if that is an ideal fit. You then have the Phillies and the Red Sox. Those are the teams that were on this no-trade list. So you look at the Phillies and the Red Sox, yeah, they can move Bohm and maybe get in on Arenado. They haven't moved Bohm yet. And the Red Sox, if they sign Alex Bregman, they'd be out on Nolan Arenado. And then there's the Mets. So there is a world where Nolan Arenado might say, I want to go play for the Mets. And if he does, all you have to take on is the contract. You wouldn't have to send pretty much anything in return. And we learned today that the Cardinals were actually going to eat a little bit of money to get Arenado off their books. Could that make him attractive enough for the Mets to pull the trigger? I want to talk about that in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5. You're going to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, your live play-by-play, and so much more on this same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And remember, you want to win that first $5 bet because you're going to get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube today, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 12,000 subscribers Appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. Let's talk about Nolan Arenado's contract. Now, he's owed $74 million over the next 3 seasons. But, according to the reporting by The Athletic, the Cardinals were set to pay roughly $5 million per year over the final 3 years of this deal. Also, you still have the Rockies that are kicking in $12 million over the next 3 years, $4 million per season. So, when you talk about the money that he's owed that the Mets will be picking up, you go from 74, you take out the $12 million from the Rockies, that brings it down to 62, and then you take potentially the $5 million a year from the Cardinals, that's $15 million off of that. All of a sudden, you go from $62 million down to $47 million, plus there's $10 million deferred. So really, what you'd be looking at is paying Nolan Arenado $37 million over 3 years. Now, the luxury tax hit because of the deferred money would be closer to $45 million. So for the Mets' benefit, you're really talking about a hit of $15 million on your luxury tax payroll for 3 years. But when it comes to actual salary going to him, right now, the way the contract is structured, it's $21 million in 2025 that the Cardinals are set to pay, $16 million in 2026, $15 million in 2027. All of a sudden, if the Cardinals kick in $5 million per year, you're knocking that down to $16 million in 2025, $11 million in 2026, $10 million in 2027. So now let's just say Nolan Arenado plays for the Mets in 25 and 26. And now 2027 comes around and I don't know, there's some stud third baseman the Mets want to acquire. Something breaks where they have another option. They want Arenado off their books. Owed $10 million by the Mets. For one, they could outright cut him. Or maybe you send him to the Angels at that point and you eat a couple $1 million and you get him off your books. My point is, it's not a contract albatross by any stretch. The only question is, how productive can he be? And I think Nolan Arenado, if nothing else, will continue to be a very good defender at the hot corner for the next 3 years. So the reason why you'd be interested is because he would improve your infield defense significantly from Mark Vientos. Yeah, Arenado and Lindor on that left side of the infield. Ground ball pitcher like Clay Holmes is going to love pitching in front of those guys. That is why you do it, because it would improve you that much defensively, and because ultimately the cost is really minimal. I don't think you're sending any crazy prospects in this deal. You know, I was going to do a show today, which I'm now planning to do tomorrow, breaking down some Brett Beatty trade possibilities. This could be a Beatty for Arenado trade. And honestly, you might not even have to give up that much. If it's following the Bellinger trade, it could be Tyler McGill. Tyler McGill is equivalent to a Cody Petit. You can get him for not much of anything, just giving the Cardinals that financial relief. And then he slides into your lineup. How would that fit? Let's just say the Mets go through their offseason and they decide that this is the answer. The question for me is, what happened at first base prior to this? If Nolan Arenado is going to wait this thing out, you're not going to just wait on Arenado, right? I think you still sign Pete Alonso. I think you re-sign Pete Alonso because I still believe that's where this is going, that the Mets are letting the market play out on Pete, and the market's going to tell Pete Alonso that the 7-year, $200+ million contract isn't there. I think he's going to fall back into the Mets' laps, whether it's a high AAV, 3 or 4 year deal, or if it's a 6-year deal. I don't think they go to 7, but if it's a 6-year deal that maybe has deferred money and the average annual value is not that bad, it ends up being a more team-friendly contract. So let's just envision this world where it's the end of January and Pete Alonso's already locked up, and you have some conversations with Nolan Arenado's agent, Joel Wolf. You start talking it over. Seems like it's a good fit. He would want to play for you. You get the Cardinals on the phone. Arenado, wants to play for the Mets. The deal is negotiated. That money is still kicked in. It's pretty affordable, and all of a sudden, Nolan Arenado's a Met. What is your lineup looking like then? Francisco Lindor, batting leadoff, playing short. You got Juan Soto in right field. That's always fun to say, isn't it? Pete Alonso's maybe his protection, batting third, playing first. Mark Vientos, now a DH, batting cleanup. Batting fifth, you got Brandon Nimmo in left. Batting sixth, Nolan Arenado at third base. 7th, Jeff McNeil, probably your opening day second baseman until Acuna or somebody else can take that job from him. 8th, Francisco Alvarez at catcher. 9th, either Jose Siri or Tyrone Taylor. That is a ridiculously good lineup. That is super deep. Your defense is improved from last year because I think Jose Siri is at least as good as Harrison Bader, if not better. At third base, Arenado compared to Mark Vientos, that's night and day. And yes, Juan Soto is not the best right fielder, but unless Tyrone Taylor was in right, there was times where he had Starling Marte or Jesse Winker out there. Your outfield defense wasn't that great in right field anyway. So I think your defense is improved, specifically in the infield. Your offense is obviously better because you're now adding in Juan Soto to replace the Starling Marte, Jesse Winker position. And then when it comes to your DH spot, which at times was one of those guys, you got Vientos, and then at third base, Arenado. So maybe Arenado is replacing the DH side of it, but giving you the defense. That's a super deep team. And yes, Nolan Arenado is on a decline offensively. He still doesn't strike out. He still is a presence in the batter's box, and he has the potential to still hit for a high enough average. I think the slug is going to keep dropping, but if Nolan Arenado is batting 6th instead of 3rd or 4th, the pressure is definitely nowhere near at the same level. I think this is a move that you make as like the final touch of your offseason, where you think the Mets are done. You think the Mets have re-signed Pete Alonso. Vientos is going to be your third baseman. You're sort of wondering who's going to be the DH. Is it Starling Marte? And then you swing this type of a trade. Now, with that said, Starling Marte ends up sticking out like a sore thumb on your roster. So the question is, could you find your own money dumping trade where you can send Starling Marte somewhere because he's only owed this season's money? The Mets can just continue to take on a huge financial burden, and they could find a team to send Starling Marte to where they eat a bunch of the cash and send him to a new home. I think that could be resolved because your roster is going to get short on spots. You could theoretically roster Starling Marte, but then where is he getting any at-bats? So that would be the one thing about this. There is the other road to a Nolan Arenado acquisition where you're just sliding Vientos to first and you're not re-signing Pete Alonso. I'm not as on board with that. The only way I could come around on it is if you do something at DH that moves the needle. So let's just say the Mets decide, you know what? Pete Alonso's market has just gotten out of hand. We're not going to sign him. Let's pull off the trade for Arenado, and let's make sure we sign Jock Peterson to be our DH. And now you have a Jock Peterson, Starling Marte DH platoon. You got Arenado at third. You got Vientos at first. I'd be on board with that. Obviously, anyone that's been listening to this show knows I am completely all in on bringing Pete back. But if you talk about alternatives to Pete Alonso leaving, I'd prefer Nolan Arenado at $37 million, or I guess for luxury tax purposes, $45 million over the next 3 years compared to Christian Walker, 3 years, potentially $64 million or $65. Who knows what he's going to get? I think he's going to get more than $20 million per. I'd prefer this over potentially a Carlos Santana stopgap. I'd prefer it over a lot of the different alternatives that are on the table. Alex Bregman, I'd prefer Arenado just because that Bregman contract could be pretty onerous. It could be what Nolan Arenado's deal is now, but before two other teams are kicking in cash on it, right? You're just owning all of that financial burden. Yes, with Alex Bregman, the Mets would be a better team, but Nolan Arenado at this price point is a little bit attractive. So I don't know if this is going to happen, but the fact that the Mets were on the no trade list, on the trade me to list to avoid that no trade clause, the fact that the Cardinals are willing to kick in cash, this is something to keep in the back of your mind at the very least. But something to put in the front of your mind right now is the fact that the Mets have signed another pitcher, Griffin Canning. Is this a good deal? I'm going to go through that to close out the show. First, though, another quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Select Quote. The World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, the world's top athletes get to play in these top-level sporting events thanks to one thing, that's teamwork. Teamwork can also protect you and your financial legacy and your family's future. Select Quote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. They can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's end zone. SelectQuote is one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, helping over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. Other life insurance brokers offer impersonal, one-size-fits-all policies that may cost you more and cover you less, while SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs in as little as 15 minutes. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedon. Go to selectquote.com/lockedon today to get started. That's selectquote.com/lockedon. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You can also take part in our Locked On Mets signed photo giveaways. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/lockedonmets. Well, the New York Mets have added another starting pitcher into the fold, Griffin Canning, on a 1-year, $4.25 million deal. Canning is entering his age 29 season, coming off a year where he led the American League in earned runs allowed, 99 runs given up. Now, he pitched to a 5.19 ERA. He did at least set a career high with 171 and 2/3 innings pitched, only struck out 130 in those 170 plus innings. So not a big strikeout guy that you can envision transitioning to be some late inning weapon. This is simply starting pitcher depth. Looking at the stuff from last year, his fastball got absolutely rocked. Averages just 93.4 miles per hour with very little whiffs on it. Gave up 16 home runs on that pitch alone. Slider was his best swing and miss pitch. There's some good characteristics there, but that got hit pretty hard too. Changeup had the most success this past season. But overall, I don't see a lot to like here with Griffin Canning. I'm just going to be honest here. Outside of my trust in this front office, I'm not a big fan of this move because I don't think he's better than Tyler McGill or Paul Blackburn. So in my mind, if I was to create a depth chart right now, the Mets starting pitchers, it'd be Kodai Senga, I don't know, maybe Frankie Montas, Clay Holmes, David Peterson. It's those three in some order, whatever. Then it would be, I don't know, maybe McGill. Maybe it's Budo if you love him. Maybe it's Blackburn. I do understand the need for depth. But here's my one issue with this signing. Right now, it's being reported as just a straight major league deal. $4.25 million, $1 million in performance bonuses that he can attain. Is it a split deal, though? Is there something in that contract that says the New York Mets can option Griffin Canning to the minor leagues? If there is, I love it. I absolutely love it. Last year, Shintaro Fujinami signed a contract with the Mets. 1 year, it was over $3 million. I think it was $3.35 million. At the time, it was reported a major league deal, but we learned later from some reporting by Joel Sherman that there was no wording in that contract that prevented him from getting optioned down to the minor leagues. Now, Fujinami was different. He only had a year of service time, so he still had minor league options available. Griffin Canning does not have minor league options available. He's got 5 years of service time. So unless there's something specifically written into the contract or it is a split deal, which means, hey, you make $4.25 million if you're on the big league roster. If you're in the minor leagues, you make X. It would appear like he will be on the Mets roster. And that's where I don't necessarily like this move unless you're dangling Tyler McGill or Paul Blackburn on the trade market and you got some suitors and you're going to clear one of them. I understand you can never have too much starter depth. I completely get that. And on the surface, just in a vacuum, is it good that the Mets have added this guy to be starter depth? Absolutely. He pitched 170 plus innings last year. That's not nothing. And you also have to wonder, you get him outside of Anaheim, where they're just horrible at developing pitching. You bring him to the Mets, maybe there is some upside they can tap into. Obviously, they like something in his profile. Maybe it's his slider. I think that's probably his best pitch, although the changeup again performed pretty well last year. Maybe they're looking at his sinker and they're saying, hey, we can actually give you a real sinker and we can ditch the fastball. The four seam that just got rocked. Or maybe they believe that they can change the characteristics on that fastball, maybe get some more ride on it, and maybe the fastball can work. I ultimately trust the Mets pitching lab. I do like the fact that he threw a ton of innings and he does give you another stretched out arm that can eat up the back end of your rotation. But trying to roster Griffin Canning and Paul Blackburn come opening day, if they're not in your rotation, I mean, I guess it could work, right? One of them's the swingman, one of them's the sixth starter, but now you got to have 6 lights out relievers that you trust if those 2 guys are taking up spots. And Jose Butto, he does not have an option. Tyler McGill does, so you can put McGill in AAA. But Jose Butto does not have an option. So Butto has to be on the roster or you lose him. Now, could Jose Butto pitch out of the bullpen? Absolutely. Maybe he's one of those 6. But I am very curious how this all works itself out. And typically starting pitchers and the depth that you need there, it will work itself out. 2 guys might get hurt in spring training, and all of a sudden Griffin Canning is a valued member of the Mets rotation, and maybe the Mets get a lot out of him. He's only 29 years old, and he's been pitching with the Angels. I still trust the Mets to get the most out of pitchers, and I trust the decision makers. So based on that alone, I'm okay with this signing, but I can't just ignore that he was not very good, and I don't necessarily think he's better than a couple of guys on their roster right now, and trying to roster all of them is going to be very interesting. With that said, maybe Jose Butto is on the trade market. Maybe they're going to swing a deal for Luis Castillo and Jose Butto is going the other way, and that happens tomorrow. And then it's like, oh, okay, so Castillo slides into the Sean Manaea spot that we all think could be coming down the pipeline. So Manaea's off the board. All right, they're going to have Castillo in that rotation with Senga, Holmes, Manaea, Peterson. That's your 5. And then you have Blackburn, McGill, and Canning competing for that 6th spot. McGill probably on the outside looking in because he has the option, so you can just plant him in Syracuse. And then one of those guys gets the starting spot, and one of those guys in Blackburn or Canning gets the long man spot in the bullpen. It can work out, and it probably will find a way to work itself out. But again, on the surface, just looking at the roster situation, a 1-year deal for Griffin Canning does not make that much sense to me. But if we find out tomorrow, more reporting comes in, and this is a split deal where Griffin Canning will get $4.25 million with the New York Mets, but he can be optioned down to the minor leagues, or he can not make the roster and start there in Syracuse, right? If that's really what this contract is, and it's similar to signing Shintaro Fujinami last offseason as a high upside reliever where you were hoping you got something, but if you didn't, and if he showed up to spring training and he wasn't better than the other guys that were competing for a bullpen spot, he just represented more depth. I love this move. It really just comes down to that. It comes down to what this contract really is once we see all the details, and then it also comes down to what the Mets' follow-up moves are. Don't expect, though, that Griffin Canning is the last move of this rotation. Don't think that David Stern said, all right, I added the 3 starters I needed. I got Montas, I got Holmes, I got Canning. I like the prices on these 3. I'm good. I'm out of the market on Manaea. I'm not considering trading for Luis Castillo. Jack Flaherty, Walker Buehler, those names, they mean nothing to me. We're done. That's definitely not what happened here. This is just about depth. My only issue with it is trying to figure out how that depth fits on the Mets' active roster come opening day. And does that prevent them from carrying potentially a better relief pitcher that could be in the fold there that would help them potentially at the end of games and leverage, but instead you got 2 guys who are, swingman 5th starter types that are just clogging up spots on your roster. That's my only issue, but we'll see if it actually is one once all this sorts itself out. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. I appreciate all of you for tuning into the show today. Make sure, if you don't want to miss out on any of your Locked On Mets content, you're subscribed if you're watching on YouTube. You hit that notification bell so you know when any new video drops or if I go live. Make sure if you're listening on the audio side of things for the podcast, you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every single day. Now for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports Today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league, by Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube.